So first of all, thank all of you for coming. This is the keystone event of the Center for International Studies Week on the United Nations. The United Nations, the world's premier global governance institution, is a controversial figure, charged with promoting peace, upholding human rights, establishing an international rule of law, and promoting social progress. United Nations accomplishments are often overshadowed by its dismal failures. One can only look at the humanitarian crises in Syria, the increasing tensions between Iran and the United States, and the 10 years of lawlessness that have engulfed Somalia as some of the examples of the UN's failures. Many would say that the UN has become an ineffective force or an ineffective institution and an ineffective force in dealing with the world's problems today. CIS is a joint student and faculty organization that works on bringing global problems such as these outside of the classroom. As part of our extended week on the United Nations, we have invited former Assistant Secretary General Dr. Hans von Sponeck to speak about this perception of the United Nations and to offer insight onto what needs to be done in order to help the UN to become a leading global institution. Just to give you guys some background, Dr. Hans von Sponeck joined the United Nations Development Program in 1968 and has worked in Ghana, Turkey, Botswana, Pakistan, and India before becoming director of the European office in Geneva. He has served 32 years with the organization in total, including at the United Nations headquarters in New York. And in his latest post, he has succeeded Dennis Holliday in charge of the humanitarian mission in Iraq and was in charge of the about 1,000 Iraqi workers and 500 international staff there. Citing his strong moral compass, Dr. von Sponeck has been a strong critic of the United Nations sanctions program and an advocate for United Nations reform. So, given that, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Hans von Sponeck.
Well, first of all, I have to really start by saying a very big thank you to the MAU for this invitation. And I'm also grateful to professors who yesterday and today endured me in their classes. And I salute you, the students, who interacted with me in these classes with so much interest and so much freshness, and I appreciate that very much. It would be wrong if I would start my presentation to you now without saying an even bigger thank you to Amanda and Sasha. Where are they? Where's Amanda? I don't see her. Amanda? The way these two people have prepared this visit was unbelievable. The way they did it qualified immediately for a UN appointment. Because they did it well. And when I arrived here at an ungodly hour at an airport I never knew existed, here she was, received me, and not just received me. She came with some hot tea for this traveler who I've traveled from the Middle East straight to, from Doha, from Qatar, with one night at home. I had 10 hours at home, and came here, and that made it all easy. And these last 2 days, I would say in the evening I was tired, but I felt good. And I also felt, and I say that, and I mean it, I also felt humble a little bit, because you want to do it so much better than we did it. And that is something which I consider as something especially valuable. The reputation that you have, one of my colleagues who's now a senior official in Geneva, he said, "What? You don't know Mount Allison University? It's the best for many years in Canada." And I must tell you, about 4 years ago, I traveled from Halifax to BC, from one university to another, and I didn't know about Mount Allison University. So I'm sorry about that. Lastly, I want to thank You will be surprised maybe, but I have to say thank you to Rosanna Leitner. Does any one of you know Rosanna Leitner? She is one of the contributing people to this latest 16 February issue of your Argosy, because she gives important advice, which I have accepted. She says, she suggests that I should not come with a stained ketchup white t-shirt, and I should not use vulgar language. Well, I've accepted her advice. You can see there's no ketchup on my shirt, and I promise you I will not use vulgar language, even though sometimes I'm tempted to do so. And I'm capable of doing that also. And I have done so, and sometimes in my UN life I was not appreciated for really speaking out. And it's easy to speak out, but it's more difficult to deliver what you are speaking out about. Anyway, I want to start, and when I see the first of you with droopy eyes, I will stop. I assure you, but I hope we can make that interactive. I want to discuss with you also. And I want to start with a remembrance of a birthday. The birthday was on the 24th of October 1945. That was 6 months after the end of the World War II. As a German, I can tell you I remember that war. I lost my father, lost my grandfather, I lost my brother. My father was executed, my mother was in jail. So as a young German, I knew what war was all about. And that birth, 1945, is to me, or at that time I was too young to realize it, but later it was very clear that this was a very important birth that had taken place of, well, the most global institution that has ever existed. Today, there are 193 member countries. 1945, there were 51. Canada was among them. My country was not among them. We had to wait many years before Germany, the two Germanys, became a member of the United Nations. 67 years later, now, if you look at the press, as Amanda has said, and of course it hurts. It hurts for two reasons. One, because it isn't entirely correct, and it hurts because it is to some extent correct. That is, the UN is a debating circus, you will read. The UN is intellectually corrupt. You will read, the UN is incapable of solving a crisis. The UN is a wasteful bureaucracy. The UN headquarters, as this infamous US Ambassador John Bolton said, has 38 floors. If you take 10 floors off that building in New York, nobody will know the difference. These are the sort of perceptions that I read about, and I can assure you, and I want to say this really emphatically, I would not have traveled across the Atlantic to Mount Allison, to Sackville, if I would agree with that kind of assessment. There are truth in this. Yes, there is a convoluted bureaucracy. Yes, there is corruption, to some extent intellectual corruption. But to make that sweeping statement about an institution where 55,000 people live, work, and give their best is painfully wrong and inaccurate. And I know that I have to stand in front of you here and make a defense of that institution, even though that defense isn't always so easy. And I will explain, of course, why. What is easy for me is that with 32 years having lived and worked in that institution, and my family with me except for Iraq, where I was not allowed to take my family, my children, my wife, it is easy for me to stand in front of you and speak with confidence and with conviction, and I will try to avoid, a little bit of blue-eyedness is not bad in life. To be naive isn't entirely bad. It's sometimes good to be naive. because if you're naive, then you can be more focused. But I'm not coming here to be a blue-eyed defender of our dream about a global peace and a global tranquility and harmony among people that really, unfortunately, in no time of history ever existed. We've had, in the United Nations, we've had 8 UN Secretary Generals. The first one was from Norway, the second one was from Sweden, Dag Hammarskjöld, the first one was Brigham Lee, the third one was U Thant from Myanmar or Burma, the fourth one was Kurt Waldheim from Austria, the fifth one was from Peru, Pérez de Cuellar, the sixth one was Boutros Ghali, the seventh one was the one with whom I had the most intensive contact, Kofi Annan, and the eighth one is, of course, Ban Ki-moon from Korea. My role model certainly is, apart from Kofi Annan, whom I very much like and cooperated well with him in difficult times. I was delighted to see in the Office of International Development Studies, Center for International Studies, a picture of Kofi Annan where it says, "What would Kofi say?" And we took a picture this afternoon of that, and I will send it to Kofi Annan. Yeah, and I made sure, I asked Amanda to put a little flyer which says Mount Allison University, so you can see it's Mount Allison University that says, "What would Kofi say?" And I pledge to you, and Amanda will communicate it to you, when he answers, and I think he will answer, what he answers. Okay? So, but my role model, my deep appreciation of this second Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, I want to stress here. And I want to quote him twice. But the first quote here is a very powerful reminder, and I think it was, here you see this combination of vision, of dreaming and realism, when he said the United Nations was not created to get us into heaven, but it was created to protect us from hell. I think that is, very well put. You can look, we have a saying in German, a very beautiful saying, look to the stars, but keep your feet on the ground. You must be idealistic. We all must have our dreams, but we must keep our feet on the ground if we want to move on. And I think that statement from him is so acceptable to me. Let's look a little bit at the achievements in that spirit and at the shortcomings. And I want to structure that by looking at the normative level, the legal level if you want, at the political and at the operational level, and see how things are then appearing to you and reappearing to me. What can one say about today's March 2012 international relations and the prevailing international security architecture? I want to ask a few questions. I think one has to answer the question, why is the UN today what it is? And why, more concretely, why was there a Security Council vote on Syria that turned out to be as it was, with Russia and China vetoing, and the US using the strongest language that I have ever come across, when Ambassador Susan Rice referred to the veto of the Russians and the Chinese by calling it disgusting. Now, normally, diplomats don't use such language. It was, it must have been really enormously appalling to the Americans to see this Russian and the Chinese veto. I happened to be on that 4th of February in Munich, in the Munich Security Conference, where Mr. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, spoke. And on that same day, when the veto was cast by the Russians and the Chinese in the Security Council, he spoke in Munich, pointing out that there was still hope that there would be an agreement. And there was ultimately no agreement. Now we can speculate. We can ask the question, why was that suddenly as it turned out to be? In Doha, in Qatar, where I attended an Arab League meeting just a few days ago, a person who attended the meeting in New York tried to explain it to me, it wasn't, I still don't fully understand what went on behind the scene, but obviously the Russians and the Chinese were not satisfied with the draft, and Mr. Lavrov in Munich said the United Nations, and he's right there, the United Nations cannot be in the business of regime change. We cannot, if we start in the Security Council to debate the removal of governments, that's the end of the United Nations. We can talk about putting pressure, but the call for regime change cannot be something which is discussed. Well, maybe you will disagree, we can talk about it. Other questions, why is the UN involvement so weak, so inadequate in some of the conflicts to which Amanda also referred? North Korea, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, Israel, particularly, very complicated and very weak role by the United. Why is that so? That's on the negative side. On the positive side, questions that can be raised is, why are there 193 countries in the United Nations? Why is it that hardly ever there is no country that ever left because they were dissatisfied with the United Nations? They all think it's important that one stays and remains a member. Why is Palestine so enormously anxious to belong to the United Nations? Why was Southern Sudan so happy to become a member of the United Nations? Why are people, normal people, around the world looking to the UN in order to hope for a better life, for more progress for themselves? Why are the smaller nations? We were talking this evening about the smallest member country in the United Nations has less than 20,000 people, Palau in the Pacific. Why is it for them so important to belong? They're an island out there. Well, there are good reasons why they look to the United Nations for security and for the benefits that come out of proper and meaningful international relations that are only possible in that context of a UN body. And that reminds me, it's not in my notes, but just occurred to me that a few years ago on the television appeared a man who was not very educated, but he said something very meaningful about the UN. He said the United Nations is the only place on earth where there are no foreigners. That's a good statement. There's no foreigner. I'm here with you, I am a foreigner in Canada. If you and I go to the United Nations in New York, you and I, we are not foreigners. We have the same territory where we have the same rights, privileges, but not just rights. That's very often forgotten. We also have obligations. So how, when you listen to me until now, and when you find out how the role was of the UN in solving conflicts, then I must give you this quote, which will always be with me, because I think it's an incredibly perceptive statement. If it was made today on the 4th of, how are we on the 4th?
Second of March.
I'm already thinking I'm back home. On the 2nd of March, it wouldn't be so great a statement. It would still be an interesting and still relevant statement. But that statement was made in 1945, when the Mexican delegates to the San Francisco UN conference, creating that body, said, he said, we are signing, we are creating an organization in which we are able to control the mice, but the tigers will still be on the loose. Now look at that. Look at it. Isn't our world like that? We are controlling the small, the weak, the unimportant, and the tigers. The tigers are still roaming freely, and they need to be controlled, and we haven't succeeded yet. In fact, until 1990, I would say there were Western tigers, and there were Eastern tigers. There was the Cold War that had come to an end. And both sides guarded their turf, like a tiger does. A tiger has its territory, there was the Warsaw Pact, there was the NATO, and they guarded very carefully their turf. The Iron Curtain was the protection, the bamboo curtain in the case of Asia was their protection. Both sides were checking each other, and it was very clear that the tigers wanted to control not only the other tigers, but also the mice, which they had already under control in their respective camps. Reminds me of what in the Yalta Conference of 1945, before the UN was created, when Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in Yalta, in the Crimea. And Churchill said to Stalin and to Roosevelt, "We bigger birds must allow the smaller birds also to fly sometimes." Well, there wasn't much opportunity for the smaller birds to fly for a long, long time. And I, as a younger man, a student, I was always impressed by Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin, where you could see the Russian tanks facing the American tanks. That was the best manifestation in Central Europe of how the tigers from the two sides were lurking at each other and were observing and wanted to make sure that they were retaining their advantage. But I would say, if you look back, we all, the global community, lost two enormously important opportunities to make sure that the tigers and the mice were getting along in a better way. The first one was in 1945, when a war had come to an end, when we created the United Nations. That was an opportunity to say, enough is enough. We must now create a win-win situation and not a confrontation situation. That opportunity, unfortunately, we did not use. The second opportunity was in 1990 when the Soviet Union disintegrated, when there were suddenly 15 countries that came out of the former USSR. When the Warsaw Pact disappeared, that was the moment. I'm not talking to you like an activist, a pacifist. I have these tendencies, but I still think the 1990 was an opportunity for NATO to also disappear. But NATO didn't disappear because NATO was fearful. NATO was fearful about the future of Eastern Europe that was still reorganizing after the end of the Soviet Union. And NATO was also uncomfortable because of the Middle East. And you may remember in 1990, on the 2nd of August 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and there was a great turmoil in the Middle East. So there were some reasons why NATO wanted to continue its existence. But NATO really had, at that moment, lost its original role as the counterpoint, if you want, in the Euro-Atlantic area vis-à-vis the Warsaw Pact, to ensure that Western countries were in a defense alliance protecting themselves from the dangers of the East as they thought. So the promise of 1945, which is, and now you have my booklet, and I need my booklet, and there is my booklet. Yes, thank you very much. In this booklet, it says to save the succeeding generations from the scourges of war. That's in here. Well, that was 1945. 1990, in this Paris Charter for a new and free Europe, they were talking about, it's always wonderful rhetoric, the culture of peace. To roll out the carpet of culture of peace. Great. The best rhetoric that I've heard in the halls of the United Nations. And yet, this makes it even more serious when we can speak so sensibly and so realistically about a world that we should have and could have. And then we walk out of the halls of the United Nations and we are talking and acting for quite a different world. So what my point at this here is here that we lost two very important opportunities to bring about a more permanent global settlement, and we carried on, and in fact we intensified conflict rather than reducing it, as I will tell you in a little bit more detail in a moment. And what is happening now is that we ask that NATO, that really should have been sent home, has grown, has become stronger, and as we a moment ago talked about 193 member countries of the UN, well, here you have 193 member countries, here you have 28 NATO countries that are also among the 193 member countries. So 28 NATO member countries that reserve for themselves the right for what? For energy security, the right for trade security, the right for cyberspace security, for them and their interests. Don't you think that there is an enormous contradiction here, or selfishness, if you want, of the 28 versus the other 165 member countries? I think there is. And one can reduce this in two quotes that I often use and that are so reflective of the situation in which we live. One is Lloyd Exworthy. Lloyd Exworthy, a man with whom I had limited, but I met him for a very good conversation in New Delhi, where I was the UN representative once, and I later on listened to him when I was in Baghdad, when he came to the UN Security Council, and he reminded the council members of something that is so obvious, but it's forgotten very often, and that is, he said, the United Nations was created for the benefit of all member countries of the United Nations, all. And that spirit should prevail in how we conduct our international relations. And during the same week, it was in 1998, when he had been in New York, somebody else came to New York and also spoke to the Security Council in a totally different way. It was Jesse Helms, the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee of the US Congress, who looked around at the 15. And then he said, pointing at them, he said, if you in the Security Council do what we in the United States want you to do, we will strengthen you. And if you do not do that, we will marginalize you. That was the way he talked. So here you have Lloyd Exworthy, here you have Jesse Helms, and they are representing two distinct schools of thought. One that wants to use the United Nations for their own benefit, and the others who are, well, call it blue-eyed. I don't call it blue. I think it's the more realistic, in the long term, the more realistic position to say we must create this world body and enable this world body to do what Lloyd Exworthy has said, and that is to do something which benefits all of us. And big deal, I can say, because it's all in here, in this UN Charter, it does say that. And anyone, and there is no United Nations member country that hasn't accepted that. You can't be a member of the UN without having accepted this UN Charter. And when you have accepted the UN Charter, you have accepted UN international law. And if you then contravene this law, then you're breaking something. So you have no choice. I told in some class, I told you that Colonel Gaddafi came to the UN General Assembly, took this booklet, tried to rip it. But thank God it was too fat, he couldn't do it, you see. But every member country has that choice. But you can't have it both ways. You can't belong to this organization and then pursue your own separate interests. Then you leave, you get out, okay, then you leave. The world will not come to an end if a country leaves the United Nations, but the country will be the loser. I'm quite sure of that. So you have these two opposite perceptions, and I want to stress one thing to you. It is easy in life, as you know. As students, you're all the time asked to critically examine an issue. So you focus on criticism. In presenting to you a United Nations picture, I would be wrong if I could criticize 2 hours. I could criticize. But I could also use 2 hours to praise the United Nations. And if you look at this UN in 67 years, what you have to do in order to balance this, you have to come to the conclusion that there is enormous progress in the UN. Enormous progress. What am I talking about? If I look at it at the structure, the UN started as a little tree. Today the UN is a big tree with many branches and smaller branches being added all the time. The structure is more and more refined now of the United Nations. The content, if you can name to me one single area of human knowledge that isn't covered somehow by the United Nations, you will have taught me something. I don't think there is. From human rights to disarmament, from environment to normal agricultural activities, whatever knowledge, field of knowledge the UN somehow is dealing with this. And if you study the United Nations system a bit more, you would end up smiling. Because from postal union to air traffic to telecommunications to meteorology, everything is covered, and it is not a jungle. It's quite an orderly forest, because there is this division of labor. It's not always ideal. Some areas overlap, but on the whole, it is a structure that is getting more and more refined with a content that covers every aspect of human knowledge. And then comes the third component, which is international law. If you look at international law, this was the beginning, 1945. Then came the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Then came the 2 covenants in the 1970s, the two pacts, as they are called also, of political, civil, cultural, economic, and social rights. Then you have a whole range of resolutions and conventions that are governing these different aspects of our life. Important resolutions like the resolution on the rights of the child, the resolution called the CEDAW Convention, you may know about it, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and so I could go on and on and on. And by the way, all along, there's been good Canadian involvement in that. The most recent one was Canada was instrumental in passing the Landmine Convention. So there is a lot that is happening, and as I keep saying, with a little bit of sarcasm, on paper, our world, on UN paper, on our world looks pretty good. The big problem is the gap. Our political leaders know very well what they have created, and what they have created is valuable. But what needs to be done is to bridge the gap between what we have recognized and what we're actually doing. And that, I think, is something we have to work on very hard, to create that political will to move away of narrow self-interests and move into this realm that Lloyd Exworthy has referred to, and others similar, and there's the group of people who think like Lloyd Exworthy is unfortunately very small. my predecessor in Baghdad, an Irishman, Dennis Halliday, he was mentioned, and we once sat together. We meet very often because our misery is similar. We both have suffered from having to leave the United Nations in protest over their policy. But we once sat together and we said, okay, we take now 10 minutes and we write down names of people we think would fit the bill of leading a global body like the United Nations. Who would be our dreams? After 10 minutes, we looked at each other and we started laughing. Because I watched him whether he was writing, and he watched me whether I was writing, and none of us was writing. We didn't have any names that we wrote down, but at least we had one name. In the end, we had one name. Guess, can you tell me who our name was? Huh? Yes, I think I heard it.
Each other?
No. No, we had identified a person who was our model. And we thought he would fit the bill of being sort of the overarching global leader that could maybe do something to bridge the gap between what we know should be done and what actually is being done. One of you will give me the name. Starts with an N.
No jokes.
Not so bad. No, but there was one that was even better known. Noam Chomsky is a wonderful person. But N?
Nelson Mandela.
Yes, thank you. Yes, that was the one person we identified. See? So there is a shortage of these people that combine the ideals, the vision, the dreams, and yet that are having their feet on the ground. And we felt he was fitting that kind of ideal that we were looking for. But, you know, this is all general stuff. I have to be more concrete, and I want to be more concrete. I also think I owe this to you, because I have a feeling in my classes in Germany at the university, also this short period here, you are anxious as young people to do it better than my generation did it. You don't want to you don't want to repeat these mistakes that were made as you prepare for life. And I think that is something which I respect very deeply. And therefore a teacher, a professor, a teacher in any school, a professor, has to be extremely careful not to mislead the students. Because you want to learn, you want to understand better what led to these serious mistakes which we are making every single day, which endanger us. Well, I talked to you about briefly about my own life as a child that grew up in the Second World War. I also look at my children, how they fare as people who are preparing for their own future. And my students, and the schools. I'm very involved in schools in Iraq. I'm trying to bring, and I do bring every year, including to Canada, by the way. Victoria, United World College in Victoria, a wonderful school. There are now, every year there are 2 Iraqi students that are there. They want to do it better. They want to avoid the kind of things. And you know, it is easier today to avoid. Why is it easier? Because we are better prepared. We have all this stuff which we didn't have in 1945. We have the legal frameworks, we have people that are trained, we have universities, we have other training facilities where people can be prepared. And they are being prepared. So we are running out of excuses in not showing evidence that we are indeed doing it better. Well, if you look at a report, and if you're interested in international relations, I highly recommend, if you don't do so already, that you look at the UNDP Human Development Reports. These UNDP development reports show you empirically, show you in great detail, show you, I wouldn't say 100% reliable statistics, very difficult to get in many countries reliable statistics, but they show you very, very clearly what that picture is that I'm talking about, the gaps that exist, and the gaps that create the conflicts in which we are forced to live. And it's all about really basically that concept about human security. I'm not talking about military security. Human security, the UN defines as freedom from want, meaning freedom from hunger, freedom from disease, freedom from joblessness, all the things that are in the human rights covenants and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and freedom from fear. Freedom from fear, personal freedom from fear, that you are being attacked on the street, crimes in other words, or military action, whatever. And when you look at these figures, you will quickly, very quickly, sorry, I saw you yawning, and if I bore you, then I apologize, but I will try to move on and give you a few things that might be waking all of us up. At least they do still, even though I all the time deal with these things. These inequalities that exist, this gap I keep talking about, is so stark when you look and you compare. And I try to do this just for three variables, but I want to mention them to you. 3 variables that relate Canada to a country where one of my children lives. I have 3 children, one in London, some of you have heard me say this several times, the other one in Mozambique, and my daughter lives in Burma. So you can imagine how difficult it is for us to get the family together for Christmas. It's not so easy. But I try to compare under 3 headings, and these 3 headings make what the UN calls the Human Development Index. I try to compare income, longevity, and the mean years, the average years of schooling of Canada and Mozambique. And what emerges is the following. The purchasing power adjusted income in Canada, parity adjusted means comparable to other countries, same basket, is $35,000 at the moment, the annual income average. In Mozambique, where my son lives, just under $900 per year. $900 per year that's 2.6%, I figured out, of the Canadian average income. So a huge gap. Okay, that's income. Longevity. If a child is born in Sackville today, it has a chance to become 81 years of age as an average. There's a slight difference, as you know, between men and women, but that's the figure the UN gives as a composite. In Mozambique, if you are born today in Mozambique, your chances are, on average, that you live 30 years less. 80 years in Canada, 81 years in fact, and just over 50 years in Mozambique. There are worse figures. If I had compared Canada to, for example, Niger in West Africa, it would have been under 30 years. Under 30 years as the average longevity in a country. Can you imagine? And then you come to schooling, something close to your heart. The mean years of schooling in Canada. What do you think it is? Any guess?
About 14.
Oh, you are dead on. 12 years. 12 years. 12.1 year to be exact. If you live in Mozambique, I wouldn't have guessed it. So I wouldn't expect you to guess it, but give me a figure.
2 or 3.
You already talked. No, I want to hear something. Sorry. No. But please. Any guess? Throw out a figure. 5? You are off by 400%. 1.2. The average, that means, you know what that means. That many Mozambicans are not going to school at all. School-going Mozambican. 1.2 years is the average that a Mozambican child goes to school. And then the UN created in 2000 something which was unique in the United Nations, and that is the Millennium Development Goals. You have talked about this in some of your classes. These 8 goals that deal with poverty, with health, with education, with gender, and with the environment. And there is some progress, but much too little progress. Much too little progress. And you know, it isn't. No, it is not about money. There is plenty of money around. It's the way we reapportion this money. That is where we have the problem. There's a need for reapportioning, there's a need for reprioritizing, and that is not taking place. And in this other booklet, now as those of you who may study law, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not law. This is a declaration. The law is embodied in these 2 covenants. But in this document of 1948, is an article which to me this is my #1 article in this booklet. And when I read it to you, well, I don't even have to read it, I have it in my head. The article is, the first part is, every person has the right to an education. Well, that's fine. The second part is to me more important. Every human being has the right for the full development of their personality. That's important. You have a right, the child in Iraq, the child in Syria, the child in Bolivia, the child in Japan or in Canada, they all have the right to the full development of what? Of their potential. Now, how do you think a child going to school in Mozambique or to go in school in Iraq, with which I'm familiar, doesn't have that right? He's deprived, or she is deprived of that right. So it's all possible if we reprioritize, if we have the political will and the political honesty to start thinking in terms of the Lloyd Exworthy reminder of 1998. And what is so incredibly worrying is if you then, again, the gap, I want to stress that gap to you. You can look at any facet of life and you will discover gaps. I want to now just look at the gap from the angle of comparing 2 figures. One is how much we invest in development globally, and how much we invest in military defense. And the distinction, the comparison between the 2 is just mind-boggling. In 2010-11, according to the also worthwhile, by the way, as a website, OECD DAC, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the Development Assistance Committee has enormously detailed statistics on where is the aid going and how much is it. And the figure is at the moment $126 billion for development. Well, if you hear a figure like that, I cannot digest it very easily. Unless I can compare it or I break it down or whatever. I want to juxtapose, I want to compare this to what we spend for military defense. And then maybe you can understand, the relationship will give you a meaningful appreciation of what that $126 billion is really. The defense figure, which you will find on a website that is also very good and useful to look at occasionally, is the SIPRI website. Swedish International Peace Research Institute. They're doing fantastically careful and good academic work. They published for the same year, when you have 126 billion for development, you have 1,600 billion for defense. $1.6 trillion have gone into defense, with the US paying about 55% of the global defense budget. Incredible numbers, incredible amounts. So you have 126 billion for, I'm simplifying a little bit and I know that, but to make the point that go into human security, and you have 1.6 trillion or 1,600 billion going into military security and defense. An incredibly fantastic mismatch in my opinion. And when we talk about money, let us remember that in 1970, In 1970, that's 41 years ago, 42 years almost, the United Nations decided that every industrial country should give 0.7, a tiny fraction of 1%, 0.7% of its gross domestic product for development. No, never was that figure right. In all these 41 years, as an aggregate, never has that figure been achieved. Some countries have done well. Norway has done well. The Netherlands have done well. Canada has done averagely. Right now you're giving a little bit more than the average. The average is 0.32. Canada is giving 0.34. So a bit more than the average. The Americans are giving 0.21, very low, the lowest in fact of all the countries. So we are not even, and this creates another element in the insecurity situation in the world, that we keep making these good statements and we are not following them at all. And that is, I think, explains a lot. And to stay a moment with finance, I want you to also understand how miserable, how shameless and inadequate the UN budget is. Mr. Kofi Annan would say to me, you know, my office has, at that time, it wasn't 193, but let's say, I forgot now, 190 member countries. He said, my office has 190 doors. Every day delegations come, they want something. They want more and more and more from the United Nations. But in terms of money, what do we get? The UN budget last year was less than the budget of Columbia University. The UN budget last year was less than the fire department and the police department of New York City, where the UN is located. So with that kind of 2.6 billion is a peanut. And if you put all the money into one pot, that the World Health Organization, UNICEF, UNESCO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Food Program, the UN, if you put it all together, the figure is 24 billion. Now, that is again a figure that I cannot understand unless I compare it. And I compare it, for example, because I lived in Iraq, I compare it to the cost of maintaining the US military in Iraq. And maintaining the US military in Iraq in the year 2005, 6, 7, and so on, cost per month 12 billion. The total value of the UN was 24. In other words, the UN has per year, in all this whole structure, has 2 months of what the US had to pay for its military in Iraq, 144 billion per year, 12 billion a month. That means 2 months. The value of the UN money was equal to 2 months of the military budget for Iraq. Now, with this kind of imbalance, we cannot expect that the UN is doing a miracle. Kofi Annan was frustrated. He kept saying, they want more and more from us, they don't give us money. This year the budget is less. They are shortening now the UN budget. So it will be 2.5, a little bit less. And what are 55,000 UN staff? The health services in the UK, in the state of Wales, have more people employed than the entire United Nations. So what are we talking about? About a convoluted bureaucracy and all? It's nonsense. It's a totally underfinanced and often understaffed institution. So, I want to now turn to something else. I have talked to you until now about the United Nations, as if it was a homogeneous entity. It is not. The UN has many faces, and I keep saying, well, of course, the obvious thing is you distinguish between a political United Nations, the Security Council, the General Assembly. You distinguish between the political and the legal normative, the International Court of Justice, and the operational people like myself in the past that make up the system, the UNs, the UNDPs, the UNICEFs, and so on. I like another distinction better. And the distinction is the Security Council, the political United Nations, is the loud United Nations, is the one that you read in the press, is the one that is criticized, is assessed, is perceived as inadequate, as maybe sometimes incompetent, I don't know. And then you have the quiet United Nations. The loud ones are there, and they are really not UN. They are government representatives attached to the UN. This is why the Canadian ambassador is considered as, or his title is, permanent representative of Canada to the United Nations. He sits in the Security Council, or she, if it's a woman. But a person who is heading a UN office is in the United Nations, is a civil servant, is a staff member, the quiet United Nations. Now, I'm not at all making the point that the good ones are the people in the Secretariat and the bad ones are the government representatives. That would be foolish. But I'm just saying, the loud, noticed, recorded, reported UN is the political UN. Unless we do something wrong, unless we are showing criminal behavior in the UN Secretariat, then we come into the news also. But normally the quiet UN is no news. Good news in the UN is anyway no news. You report the bad news, the critical news, the vetoes, and that kind of stuff. And let us, and I want to say that with some emphasis, there is a lot of friction between that loud UN and the quiet UN, because there's so much disagreement. I don't have time now to go into details. Maybe you have a question or a comment later, but I just want to point out there is that existence of friction. And that means also that civil servants in the UN are not complacent. They are not silent in that sense that they are quiet. They speak out. They have spoken out. UN staff has not been silent when this genocide occurred in Cambodia in 1974. The UN was not silent, staff was not silent when the Rwandan, how well does Canada know about the Rwandan? Your commander was Canadian, the UN commander. Srebrenica in 1999, another genocide in Bosnia. Do you think the UN staff is silent, is not upset about the situation in Palestine, the wars between Israel and the Arab world? Do you think the UN is complacent when it comes to Afghanistan and Pakistan? What is happening there? No. Or the Iraq sanctions? I told you I resigned from my post in 2003. Dennis Halliday did. Others also did. Do you think we were complacent when the UN was misused like a toolkit in 2003 in March, when the British and the Americans decided to just abandon the United Nations, go out and attack the country without any authority from the United Nations? I don't agree with that at all. The UN has reacted, the UN staff has taken a position. And let me just give you a couple of examples of senior staff at the level of the Secretary General or just below that have spoken out. Dag Hammarskjöld, I told you, my role model, second Secretary General of the United Nations. He gave his life. He gave his life for upholding the UN principles that are embodied here. How did he do that? Well, in 1961, there's a new book. By the way, it reads, you will read it in a weekend. It's called The Death of Dag Hammarskjöld, written by a woman called Susan Williams from the University of London. She has done very careful research into the causes of that air crash in which Dag Hammarskjöld died. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. He was murdered. And he was murdered because he upheld the principles of the United Nations. He was murdered because he argued that the Congo had a right to become an independent nation, while the Belgians, the French, the British, and the Americans tried to prevent that. They wanted to maintain a certain colonial involvement in the Congo. And she does, and then Dag Hammarskjöld died because he fought against the misuse of the United Nations. Nations. And what he said in that context, shortly before he died in 1961, in that air crash, is worth repeating here. He said, "It is better for the United Nations to lose the support," he did say it US specific, so I don't want to come across too much of an anti-American. I'm not anti-American, my wife is American, that's aside, as an aside, is irrelevant, but I want to just mention I'm not per se at all anti-anybody, any nation, but I am very critical of US foreign policy, that's for sure. But Dag Hammarskjöld said this, it is better for the UN to lose the support of the United States because it is faithful to law and principles than to survive as an agent whose activities are geared to political purposes. Kofi Annan, the 7th Secretary General, objected to the Iraq sanctions. He objected to the Iraq invasion. He told the BBC Iraq war is illegal. Yes, it's true, he did that late. And he wasn't as forceful early. He should have been more critical earlier. But when he did that, his second term was threatened. He told me himself that there were attempt after attempt to try to prove that Kofi Annan was a crook, that Kofi Annan had misused the Oil for Food program, which I headed in Baghdad. There's nothing correct about that. Kofi Annan did nothing that was wrong, and he was vindicated anyway by the Volcker Commission that looked into this affair. So there is that pressure to make life difficult for those who try to uphold the principles of this organization. Well, whatever you want to say, one thing is clear. International relations and the work of the United Nations are heavily, heavily influenced by what happened since the end of the Cold War in 1990. And we have suffered. This does not make me anti-American when I say the unilateralism of this superpower approach to international relations has hurt the United Nations a lot. And it doesn't, and I want to give you 3 quotes that show you under what difficult circumstances the United Nations has operated in the last few decades. If you have Henry Kissinger saying, who by the way appeared in Munich on the 3rd of February, I saw he was in the hall, couldn't walk, hardly walk anymore, was asked to chair a meeting, couldn't chair the meeting really at all because he was incoherent. But this Kissinger, who calls his embassies when he goes on an international trip to make them find out whether there's any case against him, because he's afraid that he might be arrested for good reasons. This Henry Kissinger said, we need no foreign policy. For us, all we do is interior policy. In other words, the world is the playground. It's our territory. We don't need a foreign policy. Or Ronald Rumsfeld, worse, in the Iraq context, he was asked once about international law, and he said, international law? We don't need international law. We are international law. Well, that shows that unilateralism, this strong feeling that no one else counts, but this one superpower. Or John Bolton, I told you already one quote, but he made another juicy one. He said, in the United Nations system, the US is the sun. The rest are the asteroids. It shows all the same thing, and that is a very unilateralist, hegemonial approach to dealing with international and relations. And you know, the so-called, some of you have heard this, PNAC mentality, PNAC, the Project for the New American Century, isn't just a tool of the neoconservatives at all. It was the PNAC, that's why I call it the PNAC mentality. It's linked to a psyche in America that says we are a superpower and we must remain a superpower at all levels. And the this project for the new American century document specifies the US must be the superpower, must be the leader, not just militarily, not just politically, but also culturally and economically. That's the mentality, and that permeated a lot of Western thinking. The UN, the Europeans, we Europeans in NATO, we accepted that. We accepted that kind of a leadership, this heavy-handedness, and then that shaped UN security policies also very much. The engine in the UN Security Council were these two governments, particularly the US, of course. And anything that tried to deviate from that course, from accepting that, anyone was in trouble. When I was in Baghdad, not very long, there was a press conference in Washington where the spokesman of Madeleine Albright, James Rubin, you may recall, was asked about my performance, my behavior in Baghdad. And he said, this man in Baghdad is paid to work, not to talk. That was the attitude. I was supposed to be a willing civil servant, a manager without conscience, a manager who just did what others wanted, the international effort wanted, meaning what US foreign policy wanted us to achieve in Iraq. And I wasn't about to do this. And then came this, there was, preceded this real earthquake in international relations, and that was the 11th of September, of course, which changed the entire picture, the entire gamut of international relations. And it seemed at the time, not surprisingly, to justify that knack approach, that project for the new American century mentality. And it intensified power politics. It toughened US foreign policy for sure. And that motto that you heard about, the Bush motto of, if you are not with us, you are against us, permeated, polarized international relations. And not at all just with the Middle East, with the Islamic world, but with the world, the rest of the world. It was a tremendous setback for what is meant to take place here on the basis of the UN Charter. And the UN and the global response, and now we're getting closer to where we are today. The global response to this, Western is nice, it should be really US, post 9/11 security policy, is that the world didn't stay idle in this. There were counter-alliances that were created. And some of them exist today and the press doesn't write about. I don't know why the Global Mail, for example, doesn't write about. I don't see references to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization at all. But it has become a counterpole, if you want, a counterpoint to NATO. And it is, no, it would be wrong to say it is in response to NATO. That would be overstating it. But the development of this Shanghai Coordination Organization, Shanghai Organization for Cooperation, is certainly because of the fact that NATO is expanding eastwards in Europe towards Russia, and NATO is setting up these, as you know, these anti-ballistic missile defense sites in Turkey, in Romania, in Poland, and in Spain, with Germany becoming the hub, which I find totally unacceptable, and the German public doesn't know that yet. It's very recent, was discussed in Munich, but it hasn't yet reached the media in full force, but there will be a reaction. And it will not lead to more harmony in global relations, I can assure you. And this Shanghai Organization for Cooperation consists of 10 countries, very interesting. NATO 28, Shanghai Organization for Cooperation 10, who are they? It is China, it is Russia, it is the 4 out of 5 Central Asian republics, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Turkmenistan is not a member, that's the only one out. So that makes 6. Adding 4, who are these 4? Very, very politically very interesting. India, Pakistan, Iran, and Mongolia. Now, India and Pakistan don't have too much in common here. They are adversaries in many other contexts, but as a response to NATO, they are willing to join as not full members, but as associate members. They are willing to join this institution that has become more and more and more prominent, and explains now why there is a massive counter-reaction to, on the one hand, the trend towards the east of NATO, and what Mr. Obama has said a few weeks ago. The implications of what he has said are going to be enormously important and dangerous. This idea to now focus on the Pacific, away from the Atlantic. The German defense minister was very clever in responding to this announcement. We will de-emphasize the Euro-Atlantic area and we shift more to the Pacific. He said, yeah, it's wonderful, because you have done so much good now to create security in Europe that we really can see you now. It's easier for us to see you go. What he really meant is, thank God you're going. He would disagree with what I say. But the public in Germany and in Central Europe certainly would say that. We still have, it's not clear, but between 20 and 30 nuclear warheads on German territory. And there was an agreement in Munich that, there was an agreement between the Russians and the Americans that the Russians would move their nuclear warheads to depots in central Russia, and the Americans would take the warheads that are in Europe, nuclear warheads, and transport them back to the US. That was very important, but it shows you that there is a new area of conflict evolving, and that is in the Pacific. Can you imagine John McCain in Munich on the 3rd of February pointing his finger at the foreign minister of China and saying, you will also have your Arab Spring? And the Chinese minister very, not relaxed. I'm sure he wasn't relaxed, but he was not immediately reacting. But a little bit later he said, this man from the US, he knew who it was, McCain, but he said, this man from the US should understand Asia belongs to Asia. And we know what we want in Asia. And we are not impeding anything. If you accuse us of impeding trade routes, shipping lanes, and so on, give us one example. We don't do that. So the word was keep the nose out of it. And then came Kevin Rudd, the former just resigned foreign minister of Australia, who had, at one point was Prime Minister of Australia, who said, Australia considers itself as a Western island surrounded by Asia. It's also an interesting comment. In other words, closer to the Western Security Alliance, and we know that if Australia was closer to the NATO area, they would long have become a member of NATO. So you have this kind of new and massive, I don't want to overstate this, but I think it is very clear that there's a massive build-up here between NATO here and the Shanghai Organization for Cooperation there, and there's a cover-up in a way. You read NATO documents about the Russian-NATO partnership. Go to the website, you can see it. And you get the impression, looking at that there is progress in a rapprochement between the Russians. That's not what Mr. Lavrov in London, the foreign minister of Russia, conveyed. He said, we are very concerned about these missile defense systems. We're very concerned with NATO policy. So it's anything but harmony or progress. I don't think one needs to be very analytical here. It was so obvious that this is the case. My watch is German time. It's 1:15 in the morning. But I want to know, I need about another 15 minutes. Do I have these? Or are you ready to walk out and to shout and scream? If you are, I can stop sooner. But shall I carry on a little bit longer? Okay. Then let me say there are other signs between this NATO here and Shanghai Organization for Cooperation here that show that there is really a tectonic shift from from a unipolar to a multipolar world. We cannot argue otherwise. We have too many examples that show that. One is what used to be a G7 became a G8. Okay, Russia was added. Well, today it's a G20. Maybe next year it's a G24, I don't know. But important new mixes are occurring. The traditional Western industrial partners are joined by India, by Brazil, by Indonesia, by other emerging major economic players that show you that the days of unilateralism are over. And if you want to be a very big believer in the United Nations, you see, that's a step in the right direction towards the kind of multilateralism that this charter is foreseeing. And that's a unilateralism of 193 rather than a multilateralism of 28 or a multilateralism of 10 or whatever. So we have many other examples. I will skip this now a little bit, but interesting is we also have new examples where countries are now self-confident enough to say it doesn't have to be always the traditional parties that get involved in mediating a conflict, this may be too nice a word, in getting involved in a conflict. Example is Brazil and Turkey joined hands to be involved in negotiating for mediating in the Iran conflict. That was a tremendous new effort by countries other than the P5 group in the UN Security Council. And the result at that point, about a year and a half ago, was that they were punched in their face. They said, hey, you are not a big bird, you are a smaller bird. Go back to your cages. We, the P5, we are handling, so keep out of that. That was too bad. And worse was that the reaction was not strong enough. They should have said, the world should have said, no, let them. If Brazil and Turkey want to be involved, let them be involved. But that wasn't the case. And in all this, in this process, there was very little role of the United Nations. And now we will, of course, we have seen the failure in Iraq, and I think we can say it was a failure in Iraq. That mission did not succeed. And we are about to see a failure in Afghanistan, at least a military failure. So with that kind of reality, the shift from a uni to a multipolar world is certainly accelerating. And if you then have the parallel phenomenon of a social revolution, which we have, what we see in the Arab Spring, or the enough is enough movements that are existing, Occupation Wall Street, or other movements of this kind, that too is an indication to me that we are really moving towards a world that looks quite different in terms of power distribution and in terms of, hopefully, that is still open very much to speculation also, a world that is more just, where the gaps are not as deep and as wide as they are at the moment. So one can maybe say, no, not maybe, I would say the UN role in all this at the political level is, I repeated the last time now, has been very frustratingly to me inadequate. The UN role at the normative, at the legal level, the UN at the operational level, I think there is, I wrote down in my notes, cautious optimism. There is reason to be optimistic that things are moving a little bit. When it comes to the UN Millennium Development Goals, there's progress, there is some progress. There are also constraints, the lack of political will, the lack of money also there. It is shameful. It is shameful that we don't get the funds together to be more successful with regard to the achievement of these goals between 2000 and 2015. Now, there's another, I have to mention that, there's another phenomenon that we have seen in international conflicts, and that is the shift from the inter to the intra conflicts. Over the years, many more conflicts, war, confrontations have taken place in countries rather than between countries. That is important, very, very important also. And it led to another Canadian initiative. And the Canadian initiative, I'm skipping again here because I want to come to an end, so that we have at least a moment for the discussion, but the Canadian initiative, very much taken up by Kofi Annan subsequently, is that commission that looked into this concept of responsibility to protect, R2P. You know maybe about this. This was a very, very important shift in thinking. Because until now, and it's in here, you will find on many places in this document, you find references to respect the sovereignty of nations. Now, responsibility to protect is putting that in question. The Commission in Canada came to the conclusion human rights are more important than national sovereignty. That's quite a revolutionary change in thinking, and will influence, and is influencing, of course, international relations. And it is something which is very current now, because the concept of R2P, I wrote somewhere in an article, a good concept in wrong hands is very dangerous. And that's exactly what has happened in the case of Libya. A good concept, the idea to protect people from being butchered in their country, leads to Resolution 1973, leads to a NATO mission supported by Qatar, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates. And what do we see in the end? In the end, we see protection of civilians, maybe. Regime change, of course. That was not the intention of the mandate that was given by the UN Security Council. And it is, I think, the Russians and the Chinese and the Germans and the Indians will now smile a little bit, if one can smile, that they abstained. They should probably have voted against it, but they abstained because they were fearful that that concept, R2P, could be misused, as it was. And you can bet your life that there will be no R2P in the case of Syria. For that reason, people are scared now. The African Union, the Arab League, is scared of applying that concept for fear that yet again a good concept is applied in a dishonest way. I have so much more. I have to skip now. I want to come to. I could go into details and explain to you what went wrong with this application in Libya, but I don't want to. I think, let me just end now with 6 points that I want to make, and then I have tested your stamina. I couldn't do what you are doing until I couldn't. After 15, 20 minutes, I would try and think of something else. I hope you didn't. I have 6 points to make, and then we have covered more or less what I wanted to cover. My first point is important to me personally. The UN is not a bureaucratic dinosaur. It is not something which is not vibrant, which is just moving on. The UN will be as vibrant, however, as it is allowed to be. If you allow us to be vibrant, we will be vibrant. If you allow us to be very vibrant, we will be very vibrant. Because a lot of people in the UN, the majority, believe in what they're doing. For many UN staffers, the UN is not a job, it's a vocation. That doesn't mean we are missionaries or whatever, but we know what can be done because of the work that we do with the experience that we have, number one. Number two, we have plenty. In fact, I give my students a list in which they see, I have to add now some, therefore I will not talk about 13 reform reports, but I will talk about roughly 20 valuable pieces of thought on how the UN should be reformed. So it's about structure, it's about content, it's about financing, it's about priorities. and the call is for political will. And when people say, well, what can we do? We are individuals, what can we do? Well, force your politicians to take positions. Check them, find out how they vote on issues. I think this political will that is lacking, that must be simply woken up in the interest of all of our lives, wherever we come from. Point number 3, the normative work, the legal work of the UN is credible. It needs more funding again, it needs better human resources, but the legal work the UN is doing is important and has reached very good levels of concreteness. It needs to, again, political will needs to be implemented. My 4th point is, when you talk about international peacekeeping, the UN also is making an important contribution. So I keep, the very first one was the political involvement, where I said it's severely inadequate. I stick to that. The UN, my 5th point is, as a political body, the UN should be made to be more involved in mediation and in conflict resolution. In the case of Iraq, the UN abandoned its role for mediation. We left it in the hands of two countries that wanted to go and finish Iraq militarily. We didn't mediate anymore. I was not allowed to mediate. I was not allowed to do political reporting. I did, but I wasn't allowed to. We did all kinds of things which Mr. Kofi Annan welcomed, which the British and American governments severely criticized. Example, airstrike reports. What the world did not realize is that one airstrike every 3 days took place over many years, from 1998 until 2003, with civilian victims, with private property destroyed, mosques hit, warehouses destroyed. And we reported that. For good reason, I will not go into details, but mediation is a cornerstone of UN responsibility, and that needs to be improved. That would also, if, for example, the Secretary General of the United Nations had gone, not yesterday, not last week, but 4 months ago, 5 months ago, to Syria, he should have done that. He should have gone to Tehran to talk to Ahmadinejad. He should have done a lot of that kind of involvement. Could have made a difference. Dag Hammarskjöld would have done that. Don't report me, please, to New York now, because I will be on yet another list of those who are rejected. I don't want, but I'm very critical of the lack of involvement by senior political UN leadership with regard to these crises realities. My 6th and last point is, there will be absolutely no chance to get into an improvement in conflict resolution and foster, improve, bring forward multilateralism until we begin to take a number of factors into account that we do not take into account right now. And the most important one of these factors, the most important one, is accountability. If you go into the Security Council and you pronounce on example that I know best, on sanctions against Iraq, you must understand the consequences. And you do understand the consequences. I have evidence, I show my students a letter which was written by the P5 ambassadors on how important it is not to forget to protect innocent civilian people in a country under sanctions. It had nothing to do with Iraq, but when it came to Iraq, it was ignored. And people would walk into the council, would walk out of the council, and not be held accountable. Where do you have that? So the word accountability must figure in the dictionary of international relations. Not just there, it must also in national politics. But from a UN vantage point, it's very clear that has to happen. And if you are not taking into account such items as the poor-rich gap, if you don't take into account the factor corruption, if you don't take into account ethnocentrism, if you don't take into account, sounds so soft, and it is a soft term, humiliation. How much humiliation have I seen in international politics in my 32 years, particularly in my last few years in dealing with Iraq. Immensely humiliating ways of treating people. Let me only give you one single, that's my last example. I would go to New York to report to the Security Council about the situation in Iraq, whatever we were doing there. In the afternoon, the Security Council was supposed to meet at 3 o'clock. I would come to the UN at 2:30. I would see outside the hall, I would see a lot of people drinking coffee, having a conversation. I would also see a few Iraqi diplomats. They had some friends. And then it was 3 o'clock. The doors, like here, would close. I wouldn't see any more Iraqi diplomats. They were not allowed to come, and the discussion was Iraq. In here it says, when there's a conflict, the party to that conflict must be allowed to participate at any time in the proceedings of the Security Council. It was ignored. How was it ignored, and how did they get away with it? Well, the meeting was classified as an informal consultative meeting, and in informal meetings, only members of the Security Council are allowed to be present. So Iraq was not allowed to participate in a debate about its own situation, its desperate own situation. Everyone who came from Baghdad as an official was considered as another mini Saddam Hussein. Nonsense. They were honorable, good people. Some of these people that are considered honorable were until very recently in jail. Year after year after year without a trial, in jail. Now, the invasion was in 2003. This is 7 years ago, 8 years ago. The oil minister, Amr Rashid, recently out of jail. The minister for trade, Mohammed Mehdi Saleh, came out of jail blind. He was mistreated. Tariq Aziz, deputy prime minister of Iraq, awaiting his execution. This is the situation we have, and the world is silent about this. And the world that is supposed to defend justice, tolerance, equality, all these good terms, in the case of Iraq, in the case of other places, has been misused, and I think that's the challenge we face. That's where we have to be active. And some of the things that I tried to put before you tonight, I hope you will remember them. I know that I have stepped over the boundaries of my time limit. Forgive me for that. And you would make me very happy if you don't run out now. But if you throw your tomatoes or your flowers you don't have, and a few tomatoes or a few questions, and then we go into the night and have a good week. So thank you very much for